I had never been one for thrift shopping or secondhand stores, but that day was different. It was an unusually cold afternoon, and I found myself wandering into a small dollar store tucked between two larger, more popular shops in a part of town I rarely visited. It was the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were deliberately looking for it. Dimly lit, with a flickering neon sign that read simply, Deals. The store smelled of dust and something faintly sweet, like old wood and decaying flowers. Shelves were crowded with items that seemed out of place for a dollar store: ornate trinkets, slightly damaged porcelain figurines, and antique-looking items. That's when I saw it. A doll sitting on a dusty shelf, nestled between a cracked snow globe and a faded music box. It wasn't like any doll I'd ever seen before. Its face was unnervingly lifelike, with delicate painted features and glassy eyes that seemed to follow me as I moved closer. Its dress was old-fashioned, made of lace and tattered silk, and its hair was an eerie shade of white. A small tag attached to its wrist read, $1. I don't know what compelled me to pick it up. It was just a doll, after all, but something about it felt wrong. The weight of it in my hands was heavier than I expected, and as I turned it over, I thought I heard a faint noise, like a distant, muffled cry. I told myself it was my imagination, probably a trick of the old store's acoustics, and headed to the register. The cashier was an elderly woman with thin, papery skin and a tired expression. When she saw the doll, her face stiffened, and she hesitated before ringing it. "Are you sure you want this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, trying not to let her unease rub off on me. She didn't say anything more, but placed the doll in a paper bag with a strange sort of reverence. When I got home, I put the doll on a shelf in my living room. I wasn't sure why I had bought it. Maybe it was just a whim, or maybe it was the faint thrill of owning something so odd. That night, I went to bed, thinking nothing of it, but the crying started almost immediately. It wasn't loud, just a soft, pitiful whimpering that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a neighbor's baby, but as the hours stretched on, the sound grew sharper, more distinct. I followed the noise, my heart pounding as I wandered through my dark apartment, only to find myself standing in front of the doll. Its glassy eyes stared up at me, unblinking, and for a moment, I was certain the crying was coming from it. I laughed nervously, shaking my head at my own absurd thoughts, and went back to bed. The next morning, I convinced myself it had all been a dream, but the unease lingered. I tried to ignore it as I went about my day, but every time I glanced at the doll, I swore its expression had changed. Its delicate painted lips, which had been a neutral line, now seemed to curve ever so slightly downward. By the third night, the crying was impossible to ignore. It was louder now, echoing through my apartment like a wounded animal trapped in the walls. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus. I tried to move the doll to a closet, but the sound only grew worse, like it was angry at being shut away. The nightmares started soon after. Each night I dreamed of a small child, her face pale and streaked with tears, reaching out to me with trembling hands. She was always crying, begging me to help her. But when I reached out, her face would twist into something monstrous, her cries turning into a deafening wail. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. I went back to the dollar store, clutching the doll in my hands like a talisman. The cashier was there, her tired eyes widening as she saw me approach. "I told you not to take it," she said, her voice trembling. "You didn't tell me anything," I snapped, my frustration and fear boiling over. "What's wrong with this doll?" She hesitated, then gestured for me to follow her to the back of the store. There, in the cramped, dimly lit stockroom, she told me the story. The doll had belonged to a little girl who had died tragically years ago. Her parents, consumed by grief, had cursed the doll, believing it held a piece of their daughter's spirit. It had been passed from owner to owner, each one tormented by the same crying, the same nightmare. "You can't get rid of it," she said, her voice hollow. "It'll always come back." I didn't want to believe her, but when I tried to throw the doll away that night, it reappeared on my shelf the next morning, its expression now unmistakably angry. Desperate, I tried everything, burning it, burying it, even leaving it miles away in an abandoned lot. But no matter what I did, it always returned, its cries growing louder and more desperate each time. Now, I live in constant fear, the sound of crying my constant companion. I don't sleep anymore, not really. The doll watches me, its glassy eyes unblinking, its painted face etched with an expression I can only describe as triumph. I know it's only a matter of time before it takes me too. The dollar store wasn't much to look at. Its dim lighting and faded signs gave it a rundown charm that seemed to attract bargain hunters. I wasn't there for anything specific, just killing time, wandering through aisles stacked with cheap toys, cleaning supplies, and off-brand snacks. The faint smell of stale air mixed with plastic was strangely comforting in a way I couldn't explain. I had almost reached the back of the store when I noticed it, a single aisle blocked off with caution tape. The tape sagged, curling at the edges, and the shelves beyond were shrouded in shadow. It looked abandoned, almost forgotten, as if no one had stepped into that part of the store for years. Curiosity tugged at me. I glanced around, but the cashier at the front counter was busy chatting with an elderly customer. No one seemed to notice me. I slipped under the tape, my heart racing with a thrill I hadn't felt in years. The air was different on the other side, cooler, heavier, and filled with the faintest hint of something metallic. The shelves were lined with items that didn't belong in a dollar store: dusty porcelain figurines, rusted tools, and faded photographs in cracked frames. Each object seemed to carry a history, a weight that pressed down on the space around it. As I reached for one of the photographs, a sudden sound made me jump, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like someone exhaling just behind me. I spun around, but the aisle was empty. "Can I help you?" The voice was sharp, cutting through the stillness like a knife. I turned to see an employee standing at the end of the aisle. His uniform was crisp, his expression unreadable. There was something off about it. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were an unsettling shade of gray. "I didn't mean to," I stammered, holding up my hand. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice cold. "This aisle is closed for a reason." Without waiting for a response, he gestured for me to leave. I ducked back under the tape, my face burning with embarrassment. As I hurried toward the exit, I felt his eyes on me, watching until I was out of sight. That night, the whispers started. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, an after effect of my encounter in the store. But as I lay in bed, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't one voice. It was many, layered and overlapping, speaking words I couldn't understand. The next morning, I found a photograph on my kitchen counter. It was one of the pictures I had seen in the cursed aisle. A black and white portrait of a woman in a long dress, her face turned slightly away from the camera. I didn't remember taking it. I threw it away, thinking it must have somehow fallen into my bag by mistake. But the following night, it was back, lying in the exact same spot. This time, the woman in the photograph was looking directly at the camera, her eyes wide and hollow. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening, and it was tied to that aisle. I returned to the store the next day, clutching the photograph like a talisman. The cashier, an older woman with a kind face, looked up as I approached the counter. "Is there something you need?" she asked, her tone cautious. I hesitated, then placed the photograph on the counter. "This came from your store. I need to know what's going on." Her expression changed instantly. She grabbed the photograph, her hands trembling, and leaned in close. "You went into the back aisle, didn't you?" "I didn't mean to," I admitted. "But now I think something followed me home." She let out a heavy sigh, her eyes darting to the employee door behind her. "That aisle isn't supposed to be open. Those items, they're from the old store that was here before us. A terrible thing happened there, and some say the land is cursed." "What kind of thing?" I pressed. "A man owned the store back in the 1950s, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He did unspeakable things to his customers. They say the objects he sold were cursed, that they carried pieces of his victims with them. When the store burned down, people thought it was over, but..." Her voice trailed off, and she pushed the photograph back toward me. "You need to put it back where you found it. All of it. Or it won't stop." I didn't wait for her to say more. That night, I returned to the store, slipping under the caution tape once again. The air felt heavier than almost suffocating, and the whispers were louder now, wrapping around me like a physical presence. I placed the photograph back on the shelf, my hands shaking. As I turned to leave, something brushed against my arm, a cold, fleeting touch that made my skin crawl. I ran, not daring to look back. For a few days, the whispers stopped, and I began to think it was over. But then, new objects started appearing in my home. A rusted key, a broken music box, a small glass jar filled with something dark and sticky. Each item carried the same oppressive energy, the same sense of wrongness. I tried to return them, but the aisle was gone. The caution tape, the shelves, even the strange employee, all of it had vanished. The store looked normal, as if the cursed aisle had never existed. Now, I'm trapped in a waking nightmare. The objects keep appearing, each one more disturbing than the last. The whispers have returned, louder and more insistent, and shadowy figures move just beyond the edge of my vision. I don't know how much longer I can take this. Whatever I unleashed, it's not going to stop until it consumes me. The mirror wasn't something I needed, but it caught my eye the moment I walked into the dollar store. It was leaning against a stack of chipped photo frames, its ornate silver frame glinting faintly under the flickering fluorescent lights. The glass was slightly smudged, and there was a small crack at the edge, but for $1, it seemed like a steal. I wasn't sure why I felt so drawn to it. Maybe it was the intricate carvings on the frame, tiny swirling patterns that looked almost like faces if you stared too long. Or maybe it was the way the glass reflected the dim store light, giving it a murky, almost liquid quality. Either way, I didn't think twice before taking it to the counter. The cashier, a wiry man with sunken eyes, didn't say a word as he rang it up. But as he handed it back to me, he hesitated, his fingers brushing against mine. "Be careful with that," he muttered almost under his breath. I wanted to ask what he meant, but he was already turning to the next customer. When I got home, I propped the mirror up against the wall in my bedroom, intending to hang it later. I spent the rest of the evening going about my routine, cooking dinner, watching TV, and scrolling mindlessly through my phone. It wasn't until I was brushing my teeth that I noticed something strange. The reflection in the mirror seemed off. It was subtle at first, a slight delay in the way my reflection moved, like an old video buffering. I waved my hand experimentally and the reflection followed, but not quite in sync. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the dim light or the smudged glass. But as the days went on, the discrepancies became harder to ignore. One night, as I sat on the edge of my bed scrolling through my phone, I caught movement in the mirror out of the corner of my eye. It was subtle, just a flicker, but when I turned to look, my reflection was still, too still. I leaned closer, studying the glass. My reflection stared back, perfectly mimicking my every move. But then it smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that I knew I wasn't. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The reflection's expression returned to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next day, I tried to get rid of the mirror. I carried it down to the dumpster behind my apartment building, shoving it unceremoniously into the trash. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief. That relief evaporated the moment I walked back into my bedroom. The mirror was propped up against the wall as if it had never left. I stared at it, my mind racing. Maybe I had imagined throwing it away. Maybe I was overtired, or maybe I was losing my grip on reality. But deep down, I knew the truth. That night, I locked the mirror in my closet and pushed a heavy dresser in front of the door for good measure. But the dreams that followed were worse than any waking nightmare. In my dream, I was standing in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. Only it wasn't my reflection. It was something else, something darker. Its eyes were too bright, its smile too wide, and when it reached out, its hand came through the glass. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. The closet door was open, the mirror leaning innocently against the wall. I tried to ignore it, to go about my life as if everything was normal. But strange things started happening. I would black out for hours at a time, waking up in places I didn't remember going. Friends told me I'd said or done things I had no memory of. The worst part was the mirror. No matter where I moved it or how far I tried to get away, it always came back. Its presence was suffocating, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. One night, in a fit of desperation, I smashed the mirror with a hammer. The glass shattered into 1,000 tiny shards, scattering across the floor. For a moment, I felt victorious, as if I'd finally freed myself. But then the pieces began to move. They twitched and trembled, pulling together like metal shavings drawn to a magnet. The shards reassembled, reforming the mirror right before my eyes. Only now, the reflection staring back at me wasn't mine. It was the other me, the darker, twisted version from my dreams. It smiled that same unnerving smile and raised a hand to the glass. I couldn't move. I could only watch as the hand pushed through the surface, the glass rippling like water. It stepped out, standing inches away from me, its eyes gleaming with malice. "You're free now," it said, its voice a distorted echo of my own. Before I could scream, it shoved me backward, into the mirror. I hit the glass, expecting it to shatter, but instead, I fell through, tumbling into a cold, dark void. When I looked up, I saw myself, or what looked like me, grinning from the other side. Now I'm trapped here, watching as it lives my life. No one can tell the difference. It smiles at my friends, goes to my job, and sleeps in my bed. But sometimes, late at night, it looks into the mirror. It looks directly at me and smiles, as if to remind me that I'll never escape. It was one of those rainy afternoons where the sky was a dull gray, and the air carried the scent of wet asphalt. I had some time to kill, so I wandered into a dollar store tucked at the edge of town. It wasn't a place I visited often, but its faded sign and peeling paint seemed inviting in a strange, nostalgic way. The store was nearly empty save for a clerk who sat at the counter flipping through a magazine. The aisles were cluttered, filled with the usual assortment of cheap household items, random knickknacks. But in the back corner, there was a clearance section, a makeshift pile of mismatched items marked with bright red stickers. That's where I found the box. It was small, no bigger than a shoebox, and made of dark, polished wood. The lid was carved with an intricate pattern of swirling lines that seemed to shift if you stared too long. There was no price sticker on it, but I felt an odd pull, like the box was meant for me. When I brought it to the counter, the clerk's demeanor shifted instantly. He looked at the box, then at me, his face pale. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice tight. "In the clearance section," I said, confused. "It doesn't have a price." He hesitated, then shrugged. "Take it. No charge." I blinked. "Are you sure?" "Yes," he said quickly, his eyes darting to the box, as if he couldn't bear to look at it for long. "Just take it and go." I left the store feeling more intrigued than unsettled. Free or not, the box was beautifully crafted, and I couldn't wait to see what was inside. When I got home, I set it on the coffee table and carefully opened the lid. Inside, there was a folded piece of paper resting on a layer of black velvet. No jewelry, no trinkets, just the note. The paper was yellowed and brittle, and the handwriting was jagged, as if written in haste. It read, "Do not open at night." I laughed nervously. It had to be some kind of joke, a weird marketing gimmick or an attempt to make the box seem mysterious. But there was something about the note that stuck with me, an uneasy feeling that lingered even after I put the box aside. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself staring at the box across the room. The note replayed in my mind over and over. "Do not open at night. Curiosity 1." I got up, flipped on the lamp, and opened the box again. This time, the velvet lining seemed darker, deeper, almost like it absorbed the light. The air in the room grew colder, and I noticed something new, a faint sound like whispering coming from the box. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, until they became a low, guttural growl. I slammed the lid shut, stumbling backward. The growling stopped, but the air still felt heavy, oppressive. I shoved the box into a drawer and tried to convince myself I was imagining, but the nightmares started that night. In my dreams, I was back in the dollar store, standing in the clearance section. The box was there, but it was larger now, towering over me. The carvings on the lid pulsed like living veins, and the whispers were deafening. A figure stood behind the box, tall, shadowy, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It didn't speak, but I felt its gaze pierce through me, freezing me in place. I woke up drenched in sweat, the whispering still echoing faintly in my ears. Over the next few days, the box began to change. The carvings on the lid seemed more pronounced, the swirling patterns twisting into shapes that looked like faces, twisted, screaming faces. The growling returned, soft at first, but growing louder each night. I tried to get rid of it. I threw it in the trash, buried it in the woods, even left it by the side of the road miles from my house. But every time, the box reappeared in my living room, sitting innocently on the coffee table, as if it had never left. The nightmares grew worse. The shadowy figure in my dreams started speaking, its voice a raspy whisper that I couldn't understand. It reached for me with long, clawed fingers, and when I woke up, there were scratches on my arms that hadn't been there before. Desperate, I returned to the dollar store. The clerk was gone, replaced by a woman who claimed she'd never seen him before. When I asked about the box, she just stared at me blankly, as if she had no idea what I was talking about. I don't know what to do anymore. The box is still here, the growling louder than ever. The shadowy figure from my dreams has started appearing in the corner of my room, just out of reach, its glowing eyes watching me. I can't sleep. I can't think. The box won't let me go, and I'm terrified of what will happen if I open it again. But the whispers are getting harder to ignore. It was a quiet Sunday evening when I first noticed the doll. I'd gone to the dollar store earlier that day to pick up some cleaning supplies and a new set of light bulbs. While browsing the aisles, I saw it sitting on a shelf in the toy section, a small porcelain doll with a cracked face and lifeless black eyes. I'm not sure why I bought it. Maybe it was the absurdity of such an eerie thing being sold for $1, or maybe it was the way it seemed to look at me as I passed by. I told myself it would make for a fun, creepy decoration, something to laugh about with friends when they visited. When I got home, I placed the doll on a shelf in my living room, right between some books and an old clock. It looked even creepier in the dim light of my apartment, its cracked face casting strange shadows on the wall. That night, as I sat on my couch scrolling through my phone, I thought I heard a soft rustling sound. I paused, holding my breath, but the apartment was silent. Shaking my head, I dismissed it as paranoia and went to bed. The next morning, I found the doll lying on the floor. It must have fallen, I thought. Maybe the vibrations from the clock or a draft had knocked it over. I picked it up and placed it back on the shelf, telling myself it was no big deal. But the following night, the doll was on the floor again, this time several feet from the shelf. I stared at it, unease creeping up my spine. I didn't remember hearing anything during the night, and the way it was positioned, face down, arms outstretched, felt intentional, as if it had been placed there by someone. I decided to put it in a box, thinking I'd deal with it later. I shoved the box into a closet, closed the door, and tried to forget about it. That night, I woke up to the sound of faint tapping. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder and more insistent. I sat up, my heart pounding, and realized it was coming from the closet. I told myself it wasn't possible. It had to be the pipes, or maybe a mouse, but deep down, I knew better. Slowly, I got out of bed and opened the closet door. The box was there, untouched, but when I lifted the lid, the doll was sitting upright, its head tilted slightly to the side, as if it were looking at me. I nearly dropped it, my hands trembling. I wanted to throw it away, to get rid of it entirely, but something stopped me, a nagging feeling that getting rid of it would only make things worse. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and strange occurrences. The doll would move on its own, appearing in different parts of the apartment no matter where I left it. I started hearing whispers, soft and garbled, coming from the corner of the room where the doll sat. My friends laughed when I told them about it, brushing it off as stress and overactive imagination. But their laughter stopped when one of them came over and saw the doll's head turn on its own. We both froze, staring at it in stunned silence. My friend left immediately, refusing to come back, and I was left alone with the doll. Desperate, I tried burning it. I took it to a secluded spot in the woods, poured lighter fluid over it, and set it on fire. The flames consumed it quickly, the porcelain cracking and blackening until there was nothing left but ash. For the first time in weeks, I felt relief. But when I got home, the doll was waiting for me, sitting on the couch with its head tilted in that same unnerving way. Its face was unburned, the crack from before now completely gone. The whispers grew louder that night, turning into distorted voices that seemed to echo inside my head. I started seeing shadows moving in the corners of my vision, shapes that didn't belong. The air in my apartment grew colder, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. I finally decided to do some research, combing through forums and old articles about haunted objects. What I found made my blood run cold. Stories of cursed dolls that acted as vessels for restless spirits, objects that attached themselves to their owners and refused to let go. One forum mentioned a ritual to sever the bond, but it was risky and had to be performed perfectly. I had no other choice. That night I followed the instructions to the letter, drawing symbols around the doll and reciting the incantation. The air grew thick, the whispers turning into anguished screams. The doll's eyes seemed to glow, and for a moment I thought I saw a face, distorted and monstrous, emerging from its cracked surface. Then everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, the doll was gone. The air felt lighter. The oppressive presence lifted. I thought it was over. But now, as I write this, I feel a familiar chill. The whispers have returned, faint but unmistakable, and I can't shake the feeling that something is standing just behind me. It started on a whim, a late-night trip to the dollar store with my roommate Zoe. We were bored, restless, and looking for something to do. The store was nearly empty when we arrived, the overhead lights buzzing faintly in the silence. We wandered the aisles, laughing at the random assortment of items. Zoe grabbed a ridiculous plastic tiara, and I found a pack of glow-in-the-dark stickers. But as we moved toward the back of the store, the atmosphere shifted. The lights seemed dimmer there, the air colder. That's when I saw the box. It was small and wooden, sitting alone on an otherwise empty shelf. Its surface was covered in strange, angular carvings that didn't look like anything I recognized. Beside it was a folded piece of paper with a handwritten note. "Take it, but beware of the midnight bargain." I laughed and showed it to Zoe, who raised an eyebrow. "What do you think that means?" she asked. "No idea, but it sounds like some cheesy marketing gimmick," I said, picking up the box. It was heavier than I expected, and the carvings felt rough under my fingers. "Are you seriously buying that?" Zoe asked, skeptical. "Why not? It's only $1." The cashier didn't say anything as he rang it up, but he avoided looking at the box as he placed it in a bag. When we got home, we dumped our purchases on the coffee table. Zoe immediately lost interest in the box, focusing instead on her new tiara, but I couldn't stop staring at it. Something about it felt wrong. Still, my curiosity got the better of me. I opened the lid. Inside was a small tarnished coin, unlike any currency I'd ever seen. It was round and dark, with a faint shimmer that made it look almost alive. One side was blank, while the other had a symbol carved into it, a crude, jagged eye. Cool, Zoe said, glancing over. Looks old. Maybe it's worth something. I shrugged, putting the coin back in the box. Probably just some fake antique junk. That night, I woke up to the sound of faint tapping. At first, I thought it was coming from the window, but as I sat up, I realized it was coming from the box. I hesitated, my heart racing, before slowly opening the lid. The coin was gone. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural voice that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. The bargain begins. I froze, unable to speak or move. The room grew colder and shadows began to stretch across the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. Zoe burst into the room, flipping on the light. "What the hell is going on?" she asked, looking around in alarm. I pointed to the box, my voice barely a whisper. "The coin? It's gone!" She frowned, picking up the box and peering inside. "There's nothing in here." "No, you don't understand," I said, trembling. "There was something, and now it's gone." Zoe put the box down, clearly unimpressed. "You're freaking yourself out over nothing. Get some sleep." But sleep was impossible. The shadows didn't leave, and the whispering continued, faint and constant, just below the edge of hearing. The next day, strange things started happening. Zoe tripped over nothing in the hallway and swore she felt someone push her. Objects moved on their own, keys sliding across the counter, chairs creaking as if someone had just sat down. That night, the voice returned, louder this time. "One must pay," it said, the words echoing in my skull. I begged Zoe to leave the apartment with me, but she refused, convinced I was imagining things. Then the nightmares started. In my dreams, I was back in the dollar store, standing before the shelf where I'd found the box. The store was empty, the lights flickering, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. The coin floated in the air, spinning slowly, the carved eye glaring at me. "You took the bargain," the voice boomed, shaking the walls. "Now, you pay the price." I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. Zoe was sitting at the edge of my bed, her face pale. "I saw it," she said, her voice trembling. "The coin. It was on my nightstand, and it moved." We decided to destroy the box. We took it outside, doused it in lighter fluid, and set it on fire. The wood blackened and cracked, but the coin didn't burn. It sat in the ashes, untouched, the jagged eye glinting in the firelight. Desperate, we tried burying it in the woods, but when we returned to the apartment, the box was sitting on the coffee table, the coin inside. The next few days were a blur of terror. The voice grew louder, the shadows darker. Zoe started seeing things, figures standing in the corners of rooms, watching her with glowing eyes. I began losing time, blacking out and waking up in strange places with no memory of how I got there. One night, the voice spoke clearly, its tone final and commanding. "The bargain is fulfilled." Zoe vanished that night. Her car was still parked outside, her phone left on the kitchen counter, but she was gone. The police found no signs of a struggle, no evidence that she'd left willingly or otherwise. The box is still here. I've tried everything, burning it, smashing it, even throwing it in the river. But it always comes back, sitting in the same spot on the coffee table. The coin is still inside, the jagged eye staring at me. And every night, the voice whispers the same chilling phrase, "One must pay." It was Halloween night, and the dollar store was packed with last-minute shoppers scrambling for decorations and costumes. I wasn't there for anything festive. I just needed batteries for a flashlight. The store had that slightly chaotic feel, with kids running up and down the aisles and adults sighing as they sorted through cheap plastic props. While making my way to the checkout, I noticed a small display tucked into a dimly lit corner. It was a pile of masks, each one eerily detailed, despite their bargain bin price. Unlike the brightly colored, cartoonish masks on the main shelves, these had a strange, lifelike quality to them. One mask in particular caught my eye. It was a pale face, with hollow, dark eyes and a faintly sinister smile. The expression was hard to pin down, somewhere between inviting and threatening. Its surface was smooth, almost organic, as if it wasn't made of plastic but something softer, more alive. There was no price tag, but I felt an odd compulsion to take it. When I brought it to the counter, the cashier hesitated. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her tone uneasy. "In the back corner," I replied, holding up the mask. She frowned. "We don't stock these. I've never seen it before." I laughed nervously. "Well, it was there. How much is it?" She stared at the mask for a moment before shaking her head. "Just take it," she said, her voice low. "But be careful." The cryptic warning should have been enough to make me walk away, but I didn't. Instead, I took the mask home, more intrigued than concerned. When I got back, I set it on the kitchen table and examined it more closely. The craftsmanship was incredible, too good for something that ended up in a dollar store. The hollow eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room, and the faint smile seemed to shift, growing wider when I wasn't looking directly at it. Out of curiosity, I decided to try it on. The moment the mask touched my face, I felt a cold, tingling sensation that spread down my neck and into my chest. For a second, I couldn't breathe, as if the mask were sealing itself to my skin. When I looked in the mirror, I almost didn't recognize me. The hollow eyes now glowed faintly, and the smile had transformed into a sharp, menacing grin. My reflection seemed to move independently, tilting its head and watching me with an intelligence that wasn't my own. I ripped the mask off, gasping for air. My face was pale, and I could still feel the cold where the mask had. Shaking, I shoved it into a drawer and decided to forget about it. That night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, a soft whispering that seemed to come from the kitchen. My heart pounded as I crept down the hall, the whispers growing louder with each step. When I entered the kitchen, the mask was sitting on the table, even though I'd left it in the drawer. The hollow eyes were glowing faintly in the darkness, and the whispers seemed to come from within it. I turned on the light, and the whispers stopped immediately. For a moment, everything was still, but then the mask tilted slightly as if acknowledging me. Panicking, I grabbed it and threw it into the trash, slamming the lid shut. But the next morning, it was back on the table, its smile wider than before. The following days were a nightmare. Wherever I went, I felt the mask watching me. Its whispers grew louder at night, filling my dreams with twisted images of hollow-eyed figures stalking me through endless, dark corridors. One night, I woke up wearing the mask. I had no memory of putting it on, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't pull it off. My reflection in the mirror grinned back at me, the glowing eyes mocking my terror. Finally, with a sharp, tearing pain, I managed to remove it, leaving raw, red marks on my skin. Desperate, I tried everything to destroy it, burning, cutting, even burying it miles away. But it always returned, its presence growing more malevolent each time. The whispers started following me during the day, soft but persistent, like a voice just out of reach. I began seeing figures in my peripheral vision, tall, gaunt shapes wearing masks identical to the one I'd brought home. They never got too close, but their presence was suffocating. One night, the whispers became a voice, clear and commanding. "Wear it," it said. "Join us." I refused, but the figures appeared in my apartment, surrounding me. They didn't move or speak, just stood there, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The mask was on the table, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the figures closing in. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. Trembling, I picked up the mask and placed it on my face. The cold sensation returned, stronger this time, spreading through my entire body. My vision blurred, and the world around me seemed to shift. The figures were gone, replaced by a vast, empty void filled with countless masks, all floating in the darkness. I realized too late that I was one of them now, a hollow-eyed figure trapped in the endless void, forever part of the midnight bargain. And the mask? It's back in the dollar store, waiting for someone else to take it home. It was a lazy Friday evening when I wandered into the dollar store near my apartment. I didn't need anything in particular, just looking for a way to kill some time before heading back to my empty home. The store had the usual assortment of cheap trinkets and necessities, but something about it always felt off. Maybe it was the flickering lights or the way the aisles seemed a little too narrow. As I walked around, I noticed something strange. Near the back of the store, there was an aisle I hadn't seen before. It was darker than the rest, the overhead light casting a faint, bluish glow. There was no sign marking it, and the items on the shelves were odd. At first glance, it seemed like regular merchandise, cleaning supplies, canned goods, random toys, but the labels were slightly wrong. The text on them was in a language I didn't recognize, the letters jagged and angular, almost like symbols. Some packages had no labels at all, just strange, blurry images that made my head hurt if I looked too long. I should have walked away, but something compelled me to keep going. The further I ventured into the aisle, the quieter the store became. The sounds of distant chatter and the hum of fluorescent lights faded until there was nothing but an eerie silence. Then I saw her. At the end of the aisle, there was a woman standing perfectly still. She was wearing a tattered dress that looked like it had been pulled from another century. and her long, dark hair covered her face. Her hands hung limply at her sides, and she didn't move, not even to breathe. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond. I took a cautious step forward, and as I did, the light overhead flickered violently. When it steadied, the woman was gone. I turned to leave, my heart pounding, but the aisle stretched endlessly in both directions. The shelves seemed taller now, towering over me, their contents darker and more distorted. Cans were covered in rust, their labels peeling to reveal strange, fleshy textures underneath. Toys with warped faces stared down at me, their plastic eyes glinting in the dim light. Panicking, I ran. No matter how far I went, the aisle didn't end. The shelves twisted and curved unnaturally, like the walls of a maze, and the floor felt soft and uneven under my feet. I glanced down and froze. The tiles were gone. Instead, the floor was covered in something dark and organic, like rotting moss or decayed flesh. The smell hit me all at once, a rancid, overwhelming stench that made me gag. "Leave," a voice whispered. I spun around, but no one was there. The voice came again, louder this time. "You don't belong here." My pulse raced as I stumbled forward, desperate to escape. The shelves seemed to close in, the shadows between them growing deeper and more oppressive. I felt something brush against my arm, cold and wet, and turned to see a hand retreating into the darkness. I ran faster, not caring where I was going, just needing to get out. Finally, I saw light ahead, a faint, flickering glow. I sprinted toward it, my chest burning, and burst through into the main part of the store. The normal aisles stretched before me, bright and crowded with other shoppers. The strange aisle was gone, as if it had never existed. I staggered to the front of the store, my legs trembling. The cashier gave me a concerned look, but didn't say anything as I rushed past. When I got home, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, an overactive imagination fueled by boredom. But that night, as I lay in bed, I noticed something strange. My shoes were still damp, and the soles were covered in that dark, mossy substance. And now, every time I walk into a dollar store, I feel it, that same oppressive presence, just out of sight. I haven't seen the aisle again, but sometimes when I'm alone in the store, I hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I don't look back. I'm too afraid of what I might see. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when I walked into the dollar store, looking for a few random things, some cleaning supplies, maybe a snack. It was my usual routine after a long day of work, and I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The store was mostly empty, save for a few people browsing in the aisles. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the shelves. As I passed through the aisles, my eyes caught something unusual, a display near the back of the store. It wasn't a typical promotion or clearance sale. Instead, there was a simple sign hanging above the shelves that read, "Whispering discount, only tonight." The words were strange, the text flickering slightly, as if it were alive. Curious, I walked closer. The shelves were filled with items that looked ordinary enough. Bottles of shampoo, packets of paper towels, jars of peanut butter. But something felt wrong. As I reached for a bottle of soap, I heard it, a faint whisper. It was so soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as I leaned in closer, it became clearer. The voice seemed to come from the items on the shelf, each one whispering a different word, as if they were speaking to me. "Take it," one said. "It's yours," another murmured. I pulled my hand back, heart racing. I glanced around, but no one seemed to notice. The store was eerily silent except for the whispering. I tried to dismiss it, but the urge to buy something from the shelf was overwhelming. It was as if the items were beckoning me, their voices growing louder, more insistent. I couldn't resist. I grabbed a random bottle of hand sanitizer and made my way to the checkout. The cashier didn't seem to notice anything unusual. As she scanned the bottle, she gave me a small smile and said, "Good choice. It's on sale today." I paid, almost numb to the transaction, and left the store. That night, as I sat in my apartment, I opened the hand sanitizer. The bottle was just as ordinary as I had thought, a simple plastic container with no distinguishing features. But when I squeezed a little out onto my hand, something unexpected happened. The liquid shimmered for a moment, and then slowly, the whispering began again. At first, I thought it was in my head, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were coming from the bottle, the liquid inside. I could hear them clearly now, voices calling to me, urging me to listen. "You took the discount. Now you must pay." The voice was unmistakably cold, like ice, and I dropped the bottle in shock. It rolled off the table, landing with a soft thud. I tried to wash my hands with soap and water, but the whispers didn't stop. They followed me, seeping into my thoughts, echoing in my mind at all hours of the day. Over the next few days, the whispers grew louder, and I began to lose track of time. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't concentrate. It was as if the bottle was controlling my every thought, feeding me words and urges that weren't my own. One night, the voice was no longer subtle. It screamed in my mind, demanding that I return to the store and take more items. Return what you've taken. You owe us. I couldn't fight it any. I had to go back. When I arrived at the dollar store, I felt the air change. The store was darker than usual, the shelves stretching higher than they should have. The aisles seemed endless, like a labyrinth designed to trap me. The cashier was still there, but she didn't look the same. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her smile was too wide, too fake. You've come for more, she said, her voice soft and hollow. I nodded, feeling numb, as I grabbed random items from the shelves. Shampoo, soap, even a few cheap toys. All of them seemed to hum with the same dark energy. When I reached the checkout, the cashier didn't scan the items. She simply held up her hand and smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. Your discount is almost complete, she whispered. I stepped back, terrified. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice shaking. The cashier's smile widened. You've already paid the price, she said. Now, the real cost begins. Suddenly, everything went black. I woke up outside the store, lying on the cold sidewalk. The doors were locked and the lights were off. The night was still, but I felt a strange pressure on my chest, as though I were being watched. I stood up, dizzy, and stumbled away from the store. When I looked down at my hands, I saw them. Small, faint symbols, carved into my skin, glowing with soft, unnatural light. I've tried to tell myself it's all a bad dream, but it's not. The whispers are still there, growing louder every day. And now, when I walk past the dollar store, I hear it, the faint sound of a voice calling my name, urging me to return. I don't know what they want from me, but I'm afraid to find out. It was a late Sunday afternoon when I decided to stop by the dollar store, something I hadn't done in weeks. I was tired, frustrated from a long week at work, and I needed to pick up a few basic items. The store was only a few blocks from my apartment, and it was always quiet. One of those places where you could go in and out without much hassle. I had no intention of spending much time there, but as I wandered down the aisles, something unusual caught my attention. There, tucked at the back of the store, was a section I had never noticed before. It wasn't marked by any sign or label, just a darkened stretch of shelves that seemed oddly secluded from the rest of the store. Curiosity tugged at me. The place had been rearranged a few times, so it wasn't completely out of the ordinary for something new to be there. But there was something about it that felt off. I turned the corner and entered the aisle. It was quiet, almost unnaturally, with an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. The shelves were filled with strange items, things that didn't belong in a dollar store. Small wooden boxes with intricate carvings, faded photographs in black and white frames, tarnished jewelry, and strange, foreign-looking trinkets. None of it seemed to fit the store's usual inventory. As I moved further down the aisle, I noticed that the items on the shelves looked older, as if they had been there for years, collecting dust and memories. The air was thick with a musty, earthy smell, and the light above flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows on the products. I picked up a small box with an odd, geometric design carved into the top. As soon as my fingers touched it, a sudden chill ran through my body, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something unsettling about the way the box seemed to hum beneath my touch. A voice behind me startled me out of my trance. "You shouldn't be here," the cashier said, her voice low and strained. I turned to find her standing at the end of the aisle, her expression tense, almost fearful. I hadn't seen her approach, and the way she stood there, watching me, sent a wave of unease through my chest. "I'm just looking around," I said, trying to shrug off the creeping dread. She shook her head. "You need to leave," she insisted. "It's not safe." I felt a pang of confusion, but before I could respond, a strange sound filled the air, a low grinding noise that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The shelves around me began to shift, the boxes rattling as if some unseen force was moving them. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "Get out!" the cashier shouted. "Now!" I turned to leave, but as I stepped forward, the aisle seemed to stretch, elongating farther than it should. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the lights overhead flickered wildly. I ran toward the exit, but it was like the store had transformed into a maze, the aisles twisting and shifting in impossible ways. I couldn't find the way out. The once familiar layout of the store had become unfamiliar and alien, and I felt trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake from. The whispering started. It was soft at first, like a distant murmur, but soon it was everywhere. It echoed from the walls, from the shelves, from the very air around me. The voices were distorted, fragmented, but they carried a strange, desperate urgency. "Leave now," one whispered. Take what you came for, another urged. You can never leave, one more warned. I stumbled back, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The shelves were now full of items that seemed to move on their own, shifting and rearranging as though they had a life of their own. The wooden boxes I'd seen earlier were now open, their contents spilling out in an endless, creeping flow, photographs, tarnished jewelry, and strange, rotting trinkets piling up around me. I turned toward the entrance again, but the cashier was gone. In her place was a figure, standing at the end of the aisle. It was tall and gaunt, its face hidden beneath a hood, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and hollow. Not for you, it whispered, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. Panic surged through me and I ran, my feet slipping on the piles of strange objects. I couldn't hear the whispers anymore, just the pounding of my own heart. Finally, I found myself outside, the night air cool against my face. I glanced back at the store, but it seemed perfectly normal again, the lights steady and welcoming, as though nothing had happened. The aisle I had discovered was gone. I shook my head, telling myself I had imagined the whole thing. But something had changed in me. Something about the store and that aisle felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I haven't gone back since, but every so often when I'm near the store, I get that same feeling, the cold, oppressive weight of something watching me, waiting for me to return. And sometimes, in the silence of the night, I hear it again, the whispering.